My name is Madeline Carter. I'm 35 years old, living in the coastal city of Portland, Maine. After 7 years of marriage, I've always tried my best to become part of the Reynolds family, but they never truly saw me as one of their own. The breaking point was during last summer's traditional BBQ, when my sister-in-law Brianna laughed and said, "If you disappeared tomorrow, I doubt anyone would care." Everyone burst out laughing, even my husband. I just quietly raised my glass, smiled, and said, "Challenge accepted." That night, I left without a single word. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, share your story in the comments below. People do want to hear your story. Maybe I'll never forget the feeling of walking into the Reynolds house for the very first time. A stately old white mansion on a street that faces the ocean in Portland. Every time I opened the door, there was that unique scent, a blend of seashells, salt grass, and expensive perfume. So familiar, yet so foreign to me. I came from another world, a world of simple dinners with my mom, where laughter always filled our tiny third-floor apartment, even if it was just the two of us. Growing up with little, I learned self-reliance early on and never expected anyone to help. My mother was a strong woman who worked 2 shifts at the hospital to put me through school. I used to believe that I'd grow up to be just as strong as her, that if I tried hard enough, I'd be accepted no matter where I went. When I met Ethan, I was just a young librarian who had just started working at the Portland Public Library. He was a regular patron, always flashing an embarrassed grin whenever he had to pay a late fee. There was something about Ethan's sincerity, the way his eyes lit up whenever he talked about the sea, about his childhood spent roaming the family's fishing boats. The proposal came on an autumn evening, at sunset, when Ethan brought me up to his family's boat deck, his hand trembling as he held mine, with only the seagulls as our witnesses. I said yes before I had even thought about what it meant. Stepping into a whole new world. The Reynolds family is famous all over town, owners of the oldest seafood restaurant chain in Maine. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, is the kind of woman who can command any crowded room, graceful but impossible to defy. When she speaks, everyone listens. From our very first meeting, I could sense that her polished manners came with a pair of scrutinizing eyes, as if I was a polish to be evaluated rather than a future family member. "You like reading, don't you?" "That's nice, but it's hard to make a living in publishing these days," she said gently, but I could hear the skepticism behind every word. Brianna, Ethan's younger sister, is almost a younger version of my mother-in-law, just sharper and more modern. Brianna is successful, intelligent, always the center of attention at every gathering. From the start, she made me feel like nothing more than a shadow in their conversations about achievements, big projects, and their famous friend. At every family event, Brianna would have a hilarious story about her legal work, her trips to New York, or about glamorous events I'd only ever read about in magazines. Crowds would gather around, hanging on to her every word, while I quietly tidied up the dishes or listened to her subtly pointed remarks about my outfit or my cooking. I tried my hardest to fit in. I organized birthday parties for the nieces and nephews, joined every family charity event, and volunteered to help with every big and small occasion. There was a time I personally came up with the decorations for Christmas, pouring my heart into every wreath and every traditional dish. But the next morning, I found that Eleanor had rearranged everything. Every effort I made was dismissed with soft but cold reasons, like the thin layer of frost on the surface of Portland's winter sea. Even my smallest achievements, like finally publishing a children's book after years of hard work, would only be met with an offhanded comment. "Did it sell, dear? Or is it just for fun?" I swallowed my disappointment, told myself I just needed to try harder, but it seemed the gap between me and my husband's family only grew wider with time. Ethan, my husband, is a gentle soul who always tries to please everyone around him. He truly loves me, that much I never doubted. But every time I tried to share how left out and belittled I felt, he would just laugh it off, trying to soothe me. "You're overthinking it. They all care about you. Brianna just jokes like that. Don't take it to heart." Or was it, in his world, everything was fine as long as no one got angry, as long as no one was upset? Whenever I needed Ethan to stand up for me, when Brianna's remarks stung, or when my mother-in-law rearranged everything I did, he'd choose silence, or change the subject, just hoping everything would blow over. There were moments, sitting alone in the vast living room, when I asked myself, had I made a mistake, trying so desperately to be loved by people who never really wanted to accept me? I thought back to the evenings when it was just my mom and me, cooking dinner, laughing, sharing every little detail of our lives. Back then, I never had to prove myself. But here, even after 7 years as Ethan's wife, I still felt like the outsider. The constant comparisons to Brianna became a shadow looming over every family event. Every time the press mentioned one of her achievements, Eleanor would open the doors wide for reporters, proudly telling stories about the golden daughter of the Reynolds family. As for me, if someone happened to ask, my mother-in-law would simply say, "Madeline's a good girl too. She's into these little artsy things." I never knew if, in their eyes, I truly existed, or if I was just a faint color in the background, making the brilliance of the others shine even brighter. As time went by, I patiently kept building my own small world. I focused on writing, teaching children at the public library, consoling myself that maybe, someday, they'd notice my efforts. But every time I came home, I found Ethan buried in his work, busy entertaining guests, rarely having time left for me. The more this happened, the smaller and more invisible I felt. Back then, all I needed was a hug from my mom to feel strong enough to face the world. But now, standing before this powerful family, I couldn't even find a single glance of understanding. I wondered how much longer I could survive in this world, when every trace I left behind was like a passing breeze, gone before anyone even noticed. I had grown used to enduring, telling myself that if I just tried a little harder, things would change. But the deeper I got into the Reynolds family's orbit, the more I realized I was running into an invisible wall, cold and impossible to break through. After our 3rd year of marriage, I decided to take a break from my beloved librarian job to help Ethan manage the administrative side of the family's expansion project in New Hampshire. I thought that if I got more involved, threw myself into the daily hustle of the Reynolds clan, maybe they'd see me differently. Maybe I'd become more than just Ethan's wife or the outsider from another world. In the beginning, I was excited to join planning meetings, learning to coordinate staff, handle orders, and gradually taking on small responsibilities with growing confidence. But my enthusiasm seemed to only surprise people, not truly interest them. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, would occasionally pause by my shoulder and gently remind me, "Madeline, dear, you should leave these things to the managers. Don't work too hard, you have your artistic hobbies to enjoy." Every time Brianna walked into the office, she'd breeze past me with a little joke. "Our big boss is about to become an artist in residence." Only Ethan, or at least I hoped, would sometimes encourage me with a faint smile, but he rarely seemed to notice the discomfort I tried so hard to hide. The more I tried to prove my worth, the more I received looks of pity rather than recognition. My idea to host a fundraising gala that would also showcase a new dish I'd designed was something Ethan initially promised to bring to the board of directors. But when the meeting actually happened, my mother-in-law smiled and said, "This season our family is focusing on traditional events. Let's save your idea for another time, dear." Another time, I suggested modernizing the menu, adding dishes inspired by my own college travels. Brianna immediately acted interested, and then weeks later, I saw her introduce those very dishes on a televised cooking show without mentioning my idea at all. During holidays, I would spend hours in the kitchen preparing dishes I learned from my own mother. Cinnamon apple pie, 5-spice pot roast, homemade cheese bread, only to hear Eleanor quietly remark, "Brianna's mom's apple pie always smelled better, probably because she uses homegrown golden apples." Or, "The meat is a little dry. Next time let me show you our family's traditional marinade." Every time I brought up a new idea, it was overshadowed by tradition or outshined by Brianna's glamour. There were times I thought I finally had a chance to shine, but it always slipped away, leaving behind a sense of disappointment and helplessness I couldn't quite describe. When I published my first children's comic book, my heart was full of hope. I had dreamed that the whole family would celebrate, would be proud of me. But on the night the book launched, just after dinner, Brianna spoke up first. "Oh, I saw your book displayed in the window of that little bookstore downtown, but did it sell much, or did your friends just buy copies to support you?" Ethan, buried in his emails, just glanced up and smiled. "Congratulations, honey, maybe next time you should write a book about salmon, could be a main bestseller." Day by day, I felt like I was swimming against the current in what I once believed was my safe harbor. The differences in background, perspective, and personality, which I thought time would blur, only became clearer among people who clung tightly to their own unspoken rules. Brianna grew ever more dazzling in the media, constantly appearing at community events as an honorary guest of the city. Every time I came home, my mother-in-law would recount at dinner the latest case Brianna had won, her speech at Harvard Law, her picture in New England Women of the Year magazine. If anyone asked about me, she'd just say, "Madeline is still busy with her little art projects. She's very skillful, though her career is a bit niche." Even Ethan, who used to hold me every night, started showing up less and less. The restaurant business only got busier, and dinner was often just me and the long, cold table, occasionally interrupted by a phone call from him saying he'd be eating with clients or had a sudden meeting with his mom and sister. I would wait, but he'd come home late, sometimes only stopping by the bedroom to whisper, "I'm sorry, let's talk tomorrow." The loneliness grew inside me like a cold tide, seeping into every corner of my soul. On rainy days over the Portland Bay, I'd sit by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, listening to the wind howl around our big house, my heart as empty as if I, too, were fading away in the fog. I used to hope that if I just tried hard enough, I'd be accepted. But now I understand. Some doors only echo with emptiness the more you knock, and the deeper you step inside, the more you lose yourself. I don't know if one day they'll realize how hard I tried to become a part of their world, or if I'll forever just be a faded shadow on the edge of the Reynolds' lives. But one thing I do know, every beat of my heart, every dream, every word I write belongs to me. Even if no one wants to see it, I am still myself. Even if in this house, I've never truly been present. It was the 7th summer since I first set foot in the Reynolds home. The July sun in Portland was like honey poured over every rooftop, every seaside street, and the garden behind my husband's mansion was being meticulously prepared for the most important event of the year, the family's traditional BBQ. I got up early to make a blueberry tart, my mother's recipe, the only dessert she ever taught me to make during the few happy days of my childhood. I picked the perfect sweet and tart blueberries at the farmer's market, hoping that this tart could be a small catalyst, that maybe I could leave some sort of mark for this family, even if it was just a modest memory among the 100 of lavish dishes on the party table. All that morning I busied myself in the kitchen, my hands sometimes trembling with nerves. I decorated every layer of the tart with care, adding a few fresh mint leaves on top, pouring my heart into the dessert as if sending a secret message. I'm still here, still wanting to be part of this family, whether you see it or not. By the time I carried out the tart, the garden was already crowded, Reynolds' family friends, aunts and uncles, even the familiar faces of local reporters there to cover the biggest summer party in Portland. The air buzzed with excitement, laughter echoing everywhere. I quietly set my little tart on the dessert table, squeezed between Brianna's elaborate French macarons and the tower of imported ice cream my mother-in-law had ordered from an upscale restaurant. I knew nobody would probably notice my tart, but I still hoped somewhere there'd be a kind glance, a simple compliment. The party started, and I tried to join in on different conversations, listening to Brianna talk about her business trip to San Francisco, her speech in front of hundreds of female entrepreneurs, and the biggest legal contracts she'd just landed. Applause after applause, every look of pride focused on her, and I once again felt as small as a grain of sand on a vast, endless beach. A while later, I looked around and saw Ethan happily chatting with his old friends, while my mother-in-law was busy entertaining the family's VIP guests. I decided to seize a quiet moment to talk about my new book project, a children's comic series I'd spent the whole year developing, and for the first time I'd just received a collaboration offer from a major publisher in Boston. As soon as I began to share, before I could even talk about the story or my excitement, Brianna raised an eyebrow, her teasing voice ringing out for everyone to hear. "Oh, is this Madeline's new project? Hope this one sells better than your last ones. Actually, if you disappeared tomorrow, I doubt anyone would care, right guys?" I heard the laughter explode around the table. Even Ethan couldn't hold back a chuckle, even if just for a moment. My mother-in-law quietly took a sip of wine, avoiding my eyes. Everyone started joking. That line instantly became the hot joke of the party. Someone even repeated it with a laugh. "That's right, this house is always so lively, wouldn't matter if anyone was missing." I stood there, forcing a smile, my hands trembling, and inside, it felt like something was squeezing the very life out of my heart. In that moment, all the pain and disappointment of the past 7 years surged up inside me, almost choking me. But I didn't cry. I didn't react, didn't storm out or blame anyone. I simply set down my fork, picked up my glass of wine, looked Brianna straight in the eyes, and smiled softly. Challenge accepted. The crowd didn't really get it. The music started up again, drowning out the tiny sigh I let slip. That afternoon, I stayed away from the pointless conversations, quietly tidied up the corners of the garden after the party ended. The sunset cast gold across my hair, my small shadows stretching over the damp grass. Ethan was still laughing with his old friends, not noticing me at all. When he finally came over, it was just to wave and tell me to go home first. He still had to take Brianna to meet some other VIP guests. That night, I sat alone on the bed in our big cold room, thinking about the party, about every indifferent look, every cruel joke nobody bothered to deny, every effort of mine that had been dismissed as meaningless. It played out in my mind like a slow-motion movie. My mother-in-law's distant eyes, Brianna's booming laughter, Ethan's helpless silence. I realized I was out of patience, worn out from seeking acceptance from people who never wanted to open their heart. I got up, opened the closet, pulled out my suitcase, and began packing my personal things, the ones I'd brought from the dark, reminding me that out there, the world was wide and I was finally ready to step out of my own shadow and face it. The days after leaving the Reynolds house, I lived in a sort of dreamlike haze. The tiny apartment I'd once rented as a single woman on Munjoy Hill welcomed me with the sound of wind through the window and the comforting scent of old paper. All my belongings fit in a couple of suitcases, some stacks of books, and my battered old laptop. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I just lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart empty but lighter than it had ever been. Strangely, I didn't cry. It felt like all my pain had been spent in the years at the Reynolds house, leaving only silence behind, like my soul was waiting to be reborn. Texts from Ethan started arriving the very next morning, and then every day. "Where are you? I think you should come home. Everything will work out. Don't let a moment of emotion ruin your future." He never asked how I felt, never realized how much Brianna's words at the party had shattered me. Ethan was still Ethan, kind, gentle, but far too willing to accept everything, never brave enough to truly stand up for me. By the 4th day, I silenced my phone, only keeping in touch with my editor and my mom. In my voicemail, besides Ethan, there was a short message from Eleanor. "Madeline, I hope you get through this phase and come home. There's always a place for you here." Those words should have comforted me, but all I felt was distance. That place, I now understood too clearly, was never truly meant for me. Every morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, gazing at misty Portland and asking myself, what is my real worth if I no longer belong to anyone? Sometimes I'd dig out my unfinished manuscript, trying to write, but my mind kept circling back to questions I still couldn't answer. I signed up for a small therapy group, full of women learning to heal after divorce, after loss. In the evenings, I taught reading to children at the community library. That kept my days steady, even if my heart still had many empty corners. Some nights, coming home, I'd look at myself in the mirror and hardly recognize the face that had grown tired from so many sleepless nights and tears held back for too long. I wonder, if I really disappeared tomorrow, would anyone care? Here, in this old city and my tiny apartment, I might be alone, but at least every decision was mine. Every breath belonged only to me. Those first days were so hard that I almost thought about going back, typing out a single message to Ethan. I was wrong, let me come home. But I knew too well that was no longer my home. Then, one night, I got an email from an old college friend asking if I'd like to collaborate on a children's comic series. The theme they were looking for was the Invisible Ones. I read and reread the email, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the tiny hope flickering in my chest. I began to write, a little bit each day. At first, the words were shaky and awkward, but slowly they began to flow naturally. I told the story of a little girl who believed she had to please everyone to be worthy of love, until she learned that simply being herself was enough to matter in this world. When I sent the first draft to the editor, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This is a story everyone has lived, the editor replied. I believe children will see themselves in it, and adults too. I realized that with every page I wrote, I was soothing an old wound. Each time I got a thank you email from a single mom or a child telling me they stood up for themselves at school, I felt for the first time in a long while a sense of true worth. Not value assigned by someone else, not forced recognition at a strange dinner table, but real, steadfast presence that I'd built for myself. Slowly, I joined more community activities. Book clubs, Portland's single mom support group, gatherings of friends who loved to read. Once, I met a woman who hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for writing what so many of us are too afraid to say. Don't ever go back somewhere that makes you forget your worth." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that even when the world turned its back, you can still find your own community, no matter how small, where you belong and can heal. And so, day by day, I learned to care for myself. I stopped torturing myself with pointless questions about other people's approval. Each morning I woke up, opened the window to let in the sea breeze, made tea, and wrote. Time slipped by quietly, like the waves endlessly wearing down the rocks on the Portland shore. It had been months since the night I left the Reynolds house, and my tiny apartment was now cluttered with drafts, sketch paper, watercolors, and thank you notes from the kids at the library book club. Sometimes I'd write late into the night, not realizing that outside, the fog had covered the whole bay. The old, worn room became my shelter, and also the starting point for a quiet resurrection, even if I never once used the word starting over for myself. To me, thanks to the children's comic project about the Invisible Ones, I gradually became busier. I found a new collaborator, Harper, a young editor who'd just moved to Maine from Seattle. Harper was energetic, sharp, a fan of black coffee, and always sent me encouraging messages whenever I felt stuck. It was Harper who convinced me to bravely share my work on social media. At first I hesitated, but Harper just smiled and said, "Madeline, you have no idea how many people you've already inspired." When I posted the first pages, the feedback moved me deeply. Many single mothers, young readers, teachers, and people who'd once felt lost in life emailed me about how my stories had helped them feel seen, helped them feel present thanks to my characters. Some wrote about quiet dinners at empty tables, while children told me they had finally been brave enough to voice their feelings to their parents. I realized that the pain I thought would drown me in despair had become a gentle bridge between me and those out there, those who had also felt invisible. With my days busy again, I started to reconnect with Portland in my own way. I joined a single moms group at Eastern Promenade Park, where people shared tips about raising kids, overcoming heartbreak, or just sat together drinking coffee and listening to the sound of children laughing. I also spent time joining reading sessions at the public library, where kids eagerly lined up for my autograph in their newly printed books. On chilly afternoons, I'd walk along the beach with Harper, listening to stories about stepping out of her comfort zone. We'd both laugh when we realized that, despite our different backgrounds, we'd both once thought of ourselves as invisible. One early autumn day, Harper took me to a meetup of young Maine authors at a small bookshop on Exchange Street. There I met colleagues, people who had struggled like I had, who had been rejected by their families or spent years living in the shadow of someone more prominent. They told stories of failure and starting over, of small but brave journeys. Sitting in that circle, I felt for the first time in my life that I truly belonged, not by trying to be accepted, but simply by being listened to. I was also invited to speak at elementary schools and local book festivals. My honest sharing about the journey through not being seen was warmly received. Many parents thanked me for voicing pains they couldn't put into words. I received messages from shy children saying that, because of my stories, they dared to tell their parents about their fears of being forgotten or compared. Most special of all, one day I got a letter from my mother. She wrote that she was proud of me for living authentically, for having the courage to leave in order to preserve my dignity. You don't need to be perfect in anyone's eyes, just be yourself. That's already wonderful enough. I cried reading her words, feeling all the burdens of the past dissolve, leaving only pure love behind. Gradually, I even learned to be grateful for the darkest years in the Reynolds house. Those years of being dismissed, made invisible, forced me to seek a community and a true meaning for my life instead of endlessly chasing after someone else's expectations. It had been so long since I dared to watch the sunset over the sea, to sip warm tea and truly feel at peace. I realized that happiness wasn't about being honored at grand tables. It was about being fully present where you are genuinely valued. I don't know what hardships I'll face in the future, but I now know how to rise from my darkest days. In this simple seaside city, I, Madeline Carter, can finally believe some losses are actually liberations, and some pains are the beginnings of a bright new journey I'd never dared to dream of before. The success of that little comic series opened doors I'd only ever dared to dream of before. One afternoon at the end of March, Harper sent me an email with the subject line, "An unexpected opportunity." Attached was an invitation to the Boston Book Fair, where I'd have my own book signing and share a panel with other women authors on the topic "Finding Your Voice When the World Forgets You." Boston was a big city, and that book fair had always seemed like a distant, extravagant dream back when I'd sat quietly at the Reynolds' dinner table, listening to others talk about their achievements. But Harper encouraged me. "Madeline, you've inspired so many already. Now it's time to be proud of yourself." I accepted. The days of preparation passed in a blur. I picked out simple dresses, packed my books in a suitcase, prepared a few words for my speech, and caught the earliest train to Boston. The city was louder, more bustling than I remembered, but also filled with the vitality of young people chasing new opportunities. Harper met me at the station, eagerly showing me to the small hotel where the organizers had booked rooms for me and the other writers. The pre-fair gala took place in a wide room filled with warm yellow light and the scent of wine mingling with fresh books. I moved nervously through the crowd until I spotted the sign, "Reynolds Group Gold Sponsor." I froze for a moment, never imagining I'd run into my old family in a place like this. But things only became tense when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Madeline, surprised to see me." I turned to find Brianna, still sharp, still confident, but with a flicker of surprise at seeing me there as an independent speaker. Next to her was my former mother-in-law, hair grayer but posture still perfect, and following behind was Ethan, the man who had, for months, existed only as pale text messages. I kept my composure, smiled, and greeted everyone, doing my best not to betray any hint of nerves. Brianna immediately launched into a story about a new legal project, her eyes fixed on me with a challenge. "So you're speaking at this book fair. That topic is very fitting for you, isn't it?" I just smiled softly. "You know, there are a lot of things about me that people have never heard." My ex-mother-in-law struck up a conversation with Harper, trying to keep the atmosphere polite, while Ethan just looked at me quietly, a look I couldn't quite read, tinged with regret and amazement. I didn't try to avoid anyone, nor did I try to draw attention. I blended into the crowd, chatted with other young writers, signed books for readers, and felt a sense of true recognition from people who knew nothing about me except the name on the cover. I knew the local press would report on the event, and a part of me felt a deep relief in knowing I could stand beside them, not bowing my head, and without having to prove anything at all. When reporters asked about my writing journey, I didn't hide where I'd started. I once felt invisible in my own family, But sometimes, being pushed out of familiar light helps you discover there are other places where the light is waiting for you. During the main discussion panel, I was invited on stage with Harper and 2 other authors, sharing with a packed audience. At that moment, I noticed Brianna in the front row, sitting next to my ex-mother-in-law and Ethan, all of them focused, listening to me, nothing like the years they'd looked at me with pity. I spoke about all those years in a big house where I'd always been just a guest. I spoke about the feeling of trying to please everyone, only to realize I was just a shadow next to someone else's spotlight. And for the first time, I spoke openly about what was said at that BBQ. If you disappeared tomorrow, nobody would care. The whole room went silent, not because they knew the story, but because they understood how pain like that could turn into motivation. I said that I did disappear, but not from the world, only from a place that was never truly mine. I closed my talk with this line: if you've ever been dismissed by someone, remember, you still have the right to speak up. Don't let anyone else define your worth. That value lies only within you. The session ended with long, heartfelt applause. Backstage, Harper squeezed my hand tightly and whispered, "You did it." As I left the stage, Ethan approached. He didn't say much, just looked at me, not with apology or resignation this time, but with slow, genuine recognition. Brianna came over too, keeping her usual composure, but for the first time there was no teasing, no sly remark. My former mother-in-law shook my hand gently and simply said, "Madeline, you really have changed. I wish you all the happiness." That night, I returned to my hotel, opened the window to let in the breeze off the Charles River, and felt a deep, unfamiliar peace. The shadows of the past were gone, the laughter from that old party no longer haunted me. All that remained was me, a new Madeline, grown and whole, no longer waiting for recognition or clinging to a family that was never mine. On the last day of the book fair, the atmosphere was both lively and reflective. I spent almost the whole morning signing books and talking with readers, feeling a genuine connection I never thought I'd have in a big, bustling community. Harper was always by my side, reminding me to drink water, encouraging me when she sensed I was a little nervous before my main panel. Outside, a light spring rain drifted over Boston's shining streets. I caught a faint reflection of myself in the conference hall window and thought, this is the strongest version of me I've ever dreamed of. The auditorium was packed. The topic of that day's panel was how not to be invisible in someone else's world. I was the opening speaker. As I stepped onto the stage, I spotted the familiar faces in the front row. Brianna sitting upright, her gaze sharp yet more thoughtful than before. My former mother-in-law, calm in her silk scarf, and Ethan, his eyes a mix of pride and uncertainty. I took a deep breath, remembered all the times I had stayed silent and swallowed my words, and began with my own story. I spoke about Madeline Carter, a woman who once believed her worth was defined by others' approval. I told of silent dinners, of feeling lost among people who always reminded me I was an outsider, of years spent trying to prove myself by pleasing everyone except myself. I didn't hold back any detail, not the moment I was made a joke at my own family's table, not the silence of a husband I once thought was my safe harbor. To emphasize, some words, whether careless or deliberate, can make a woman disappear from her own life. But it's also those very words that give us a chance to find our voice again. The hall was absolutely silent when I finished, and I smiled down at the front row. I looked directly at Brianna, the one who'd always been the center of attention, so confident in dismissing the pain of others, and for the first time I felt a calm like never before. I want to say to anyone who's ever felt invisible, don't let anyone else decide your worth but you. You don't have to be a perfect version in someone else's eyes, just the bravest, truest version of yourself. My story was widely shared across media channels. Many people came to find me after the panel, telling me they too had lived in the shadow of family expectations, wounded by words that seemed harmless but cut deep for years. I realized that all the struggle, loneliness, and endless self-questioning had become meaningful. They'd become the strength I needed to set clear boundaries for my own life. My name is Madeline Carter. I'm 35 years old, living in the coastal city of Portland, Maine. After 7 years of marriage, I've always tried my best to become part of the Reynolds family, but they never truly saw me as one of their own. The breaking point was during last summer's traditional BBQ, when my sister-in-law Brianna laughed and said, "If you disappeared tomorrow, I doubt anyone would care." Everyone burst out laughing, even my husband. I just quietly raised my glass, smiled, and said, "Challenge accepted." That night, I left without a single word. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, share your story in the comments below. People do want to hear your story. My mother was a strong woman who worked 2 shifts at the hospital to put me through school. I used to believe that I'd grow up to be just as strong as her, that if I tried hard enough, I'd be accepted no matter where I went. When I met Ethan, I was just a young librarian who had just started working at the Portland Public Library. He was a regular patron, always flashing an embarrassed grin whenever he had to pay a late fee. There was something about Ethan's sincerity, the way his eyes lit up whenever he talked about the sea, about his childhood spent roaming the family's fishing boats. The proposal came on an autumn evening, at sunset, when Ethan brought me up to his family's boat deck, his hand trembling as he held mine, with only the seagulls as our witnesses. I said yes before I had even thought about what it meant. Stepping into a whole new world. The Reynolds family is famous all over town, owners of the oldest seafood restaurant chain in Maine. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, is the kind of woman who can command any crowded room, graceful but impossible to defy. When she speaks, everyone listens. From our very first meeting, I could sense that her polished manners came with a pair of scrutinizing eyes, as if I was a polished to be evaluated rather than a future family member. "You like reading, don't you?" "That's nice, but it's hard to make a living in publishing these days," she said gently, but I could hear the skepticism behind every word. Brianna, Ethan's younger sister, is almost a younger version of my mother-in-law, just sharper and more modern. Brianna is successful, intelligent, always the center of attention at every gathering. From the start, she made me feel like nothing more than a shadow in their conversations about achievements, big projects, and their famous friend. At every family event, Brianna would have a hilarious story about her legal work, her trips to New York, or about glamorous events I'd only ever read about in magazines. Crowds would gather around, hanging on to her every word, while I quietly tidied up the dishes or listened to her subtly pointed remarks about my outfit or my cooking. I tried my hardest to fit in. I organized birthday parties for the nieces and nephews, joined every family charity event, and volunteered to help with every big and small occasion. There was a time I personally came up with the decorations for Christmas, pouring my heart into every wreath and every traditional dish. But the next morning, I found that Eleanor had rearranged everything. Every effort I made was dismissed with soft but cold reasons, like the thin layer of frost on the surface of Portland's winter sea. Even my smallest achievements, like finally publishing a children's book after years of hard work, would only be met with an offhanded comment. "Did it sell, dear, or is it just for fun?" I swallowed my disappointment, told myself I just needed to try harder, but it seemed the gap between me and my husband's family only grew wider with time. My name is Lena Matthews. I'm 32 years old, and I was once thrown out of